Hello, my name is Janet Webster and I'm an educational psychologist. And if you're watching this particular video, which is about assessment of young children, it's probably because you have a young child who is in school and maybe the teachers have been saying to you that they'd like it if your child could have an assessment. Typically, schools ask for assessments when they want additional information about children so they can better target what they're doing with them. You're not sure about whether an assessment is necessary or even is something that you want to do. You might not think there's anything unusual or different about your particular child. Alternately, you may have some concerns, but you're not sure how an assessment would help. You might think the purpose of an assessment is to diagnose, label a child, and you're not keen on that. Some parents sometimes are afraid that an assessment might give the school the evidence they need to ask you to remove your child. In this video, what I want to do is talk a little bit about assessment and explain what an assessment is so that you're in a better position to decide whether it's something you want to go ahead with. Now, a little bit about me. I am an educational psychologist and I'm also a teacher, and you can find out more about me on my website, including my credentials, etc. There'll be a link to my website at the end of this particular video. I've spent an awfully long time working in schools in various capacities, including both being a teacher, special education teacher, an administrator in a Department of Education, and I've also been professor in a university training teachers. I've worked with international schools since 2002, mainly helping parents and teachers understand the needs of children who may have some differences and may need to be worked with in a slightly different way. And yes, I have done lots of assessment on children between the ages of 3 and 16. I'm making this video because many teachers have told me that some parents wait until the child is much older and the presenting issues cannot be ignored to get an assessment. In the teacher's mind, this often equates to lost opportunities. What I'm going to do in this assessment is give you some information so that you can make your own mind up. My purpose isn't to persuade you to do as the school wishes. It's divided into two parts. So in part one, I'm going to talk about why teachers might think an assessment is helpful or might be helpful, what concerns about young children that teachers typically have, and then what underlies the concerns about young children. In part two, I talk about the purpose of an assessment and how this is different from testing. And I'll talk about who performs the assessment and what is usually involved. It's also important to understand why early assessment of a young child is useful and can be helpful. So let's think a little bit about why teachers suggest an assessment. School makes very, very different demands on young children than home life does. It's not just the academic demands of learning in school. It's not just cognitive or thinking skills that are important or that are called upon in an academic learning situation. There are many other kinds of demands, such as getting along with others, how to play in groups, how to sit still, well, relatively speaking for a young child, how to pay attention and for much longer periods of time, how to control your emotions, like not getting very angry or very upset when things don't go your own way, and how to do things for yourselves. So there's a lot of these additional skills that school requires that is necessary because of the nature of the group. Schools are a group learning situation. So some of these social and emotional skills are actually quite important in a school situation and underlie how the child will actually learn their academic skills. If you can't stop yourself from being very angry and very upset, you're not going to pay attention when the teacher's trying to teach you to count or you're supposed to be listening to sounds, and so on and so forth. So home and school make very different demands on the young child's skills. And frequently this is at the basis of how parents and teachers may differ in the way they see the young child. Teachers also typically look at children in a very different way than parents do. They look at the child's development in several important areas, not just academic learning, and whether the child's progress in these areas is within the typical age ranges. So some of the kinds of things that teachers are thinking about or looking at when they're looking at young children in a classroom situation, they're looking about whether the child's keeping up with learning based on thinking skills, problem-solving skills, cognitive skills, intellectual skills, any of those kinds of things. Can they solve everyday problems by thinking them through on their own, at a level that's appropriate for their age, of course? Or do they always have to run to the adult to get some help? Language and communication skills are very important. Teachers note whether the child's acquiring vocabulary, words, learning words, at the rate that is usual for their age and level of maturity. And can they use their words to explain things, to ask questions, to tell things to other people, and so on. Social development, as I indicated earlier on, is very important. How children interact with their peers and how they respond to the many adults that are in the modern early years classroom is very important. Do they respond to them and react to them, answer questions, ask questions, or do they ignore them and go off and play by themselves? Emotional development. Are their emotional reactions typical? All young children get upset. And will cry at school or can get angry, and teachers understand that and are very responsive to it. But some children get more angry more often or more upset more frequently, and it's sort of out of sync with what's expected for their particular age. How resilient is the child? After they've been upset, do they recover their composure in a reasonable amount of time, depending upon their age, of course? Physical development. Can they colour? Can they cut? Can they paste in an age-appropriate way? This is what we call fine motor development. And also, can they hop, skip, jump, and do other gross motor activities? Again, typical for their particular age range. So the child's development in all of these areas, not just learning to read, print, count, are important for learning throughout the school career. And teachers are one of the very few professionals that see children in relatively large groups. So they're actually well placed to notice differences in the development of individual children, and to notice whether the skills are being acquired in an age-typical and appropriate way. Teachers also understand the potential for impact on future learning if the child's having difficulties in any of these areas. Now, in my experience, the vast majority of teachers want to help children learn and are frequently looking at ways to help the child who is perhaps not keeping up with everybody else or is missing some important skills in certain important areas. And they often feel the need for further information so they can decide the best way to help the child learn. And teachers also know that in the particular areas that I've talked about, in any of these areas might indicate a special educational need, and if there is indeed a special educational need, teachers know that the sooner that's identified and targeted, then the child can receive the help that they really need to get their learning back on track. So what might be some of the underlying issues of a child's having difficulties in some of these areas? So there are several sort of broad areas where a child that might underlie difficulties in some of these areas, and that might prompt a teacher to suggest an assessment. Further assessment is necessary. So common reasons include what we call an intellectual disability, where the child is a much slower learner, and they're this way typically or normally. There's a huge range in human intellectual ability, and some children are just naturally slower, and that can impede their progress in school. Some children are intellectually well within the normal range, but they have huge issues with their attention that goes well beyond not being able to sit still and pay attention, and so on and so forth. All young children have to learn how to do that so they can learn in school, but some children, their attention, issues with attention go on much longer than is typical. Some children have learning difficulties, so they do have particular issues with learning sounds, with learning letters and learning numbers and so on and so forth. And some may have language learning difficulties, so they're much slower at acquiring vocabulary and learning how to use the grammar of a language. And the fourth area I want to mention is because there's a very large number of children who present with difficulties in school where the underlying reason is ASD, or autism spectrum disorder. So based on my own experience, I can tell you that the children who are the most puzzling to experienced early years teachers are the children who may indeed have autism spectrum disorder, and for particular reasons. It's because of the contrasts. The child seems very bright and may be quite curious, but they're not learning and behaving as expected. They don't fit in with their peer group and have trouble playing, but they can talk to adults with usually very little difficulty. Some of them have a great deal of difficulty learning everyday things, such as following the class routine, how to share, how to take turns, but they may be very good at learning some other kinds of things, such as counting or number work, or they may know an extraordinary amount of information on some quite esoteric subjects. So you can see how a teacher would be very puzzled by a child showing, shall we say, very good skills in certain areas, and in other areas not showing the skills that are typical of their age and background. So autism spectrum disorders is actually much more common than was previously thought. It was thought to be extremely rare. We now know it's not extremely rare, and that roughly 1 in 67, 68 children may be on the autism spectrum. And of course there's a huge range in the way that presents itself. Any of the difficulties I've talked about, including autism spectrum, it's advantageous for a child to have an assessment to establish the skills that they have and the skills that they don't have, and to help people, teachers and parents, focus on what should be the area to be targeted for instruction or for learning. If the issue turns out to be autism spectrum disorder, then the child needs to be taught explicitly the things that typically learning children learn automatically. So I'm sure you can see how necessary it is for early intervention. Now in part 2 of this video, I'm going to talk about the purpose of an assessment and how this is different from testing, who performs assessment and what is usually involved, and why early assessment of a young child can be helpful. So I hope in this part 1 that you found something that's piqued your curiosity and that you might find to be of interest to you. It may stimulate you to go back to the school and talk to the teachers about any concerns you have or the concerns that they've expressed. And also I do hope that you will tune in to part 2 of this video. Thank you very much for watching, and at the end of this I'll put some additional information on a screen so you can have a look at my website, and you can actually email me if you like, if you have some interest in having videos on other topics. By all means let me know and I'll see what I can do. Bye for now.